overall, I think regardless of what the actual athletes are doing in the field, the research here seems to be kind of inconclusive regarding ketone supplementation and performance. So I know some earlier studies in this area showed a positive effect on exercise performance, or at least some parameters, maybe not others. And then there have been recent papers published that show a null effect on performance. I'm not necessarily aware, at least in terms of the ketone esters, that any have shown a negative effect on performance. I know many of those are with the ketone salts. So that maybe the worst thing that we can say is that these don't help performance, but they do in some cases, and they have been shown to do that. So I would love to get your opinion, Professor Clarke, on, what might be the reason for some of these divergent findings, or, what do you think, where does this area sort of stand regarding exogenous ketones and performance and exercise performance?
So I think it depends on the type of experimental setup that is being used. So we would never, ever recommend these for sprinting, for example, mainly because sprinting's anaerobic and you need glucose for that. There's no point in having fat or ketones even. You want glucose. So sprinting is out. And then we were always wanting endurance performance. So this is for people who have to go for well over 18 minutes, which, if you think about the Olympic Games, there's hardly anything in the Olympic Games that goes for over 18 minutes. The marathon and some of the cycling, and that's triathlon. Brian, what else?
Yeah, maybe some race walking, maybe.
Yeah, race walking. So there's not very much that you can do, but then, cycling, of course, the Tour de France is the perfect opportunity for it, or Kona, for example, for the triathletes, because they just go forever, and they really need as much energy as they can get, and there's a limit to how much glucose they can actually take in because of the gut and all the detrimental effects of excess glucose. So they really do need a top up of some sort of fuel. And so they need a mixture of fuels. So they need fats for when they're just going along at, 50% VO2 max. But then they need the glucose and the glycogen for when they're hypoxic or anaerobic and, trying to sprint. So I think it just adds to the fuels, the mixed fuels that people can use. But of course, it won't work if you've only got a really low ketone level. So if your ketone levels are 0.1, you might as well not have any, but you want, so that it's the level of the ketone, the level of beta hydroxybutyrate, and also the type of exercise that is being done. And if you go, there was a really good review by Kevin O'Fallon a few years ago, where he worked out that anything below 2 millimolar wasn't going to work. So you had to so during the test, the levels had to be above 2 millimolar, but they couldn't be too high, because then it wouldn't work either. So there's a sweet spot at around 2 to 3 millimolar where you get the right result. You get a result. And it doesn't, you do need glucose there as well. And so, if you have it just fasting, it doesn't work as well as if you've got glucose. So we recommend that athletes have a mixed breakfast with carb and fat, and then they have our ketone a half an hour before they get on the bike.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this too is, and Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd be surprised if every Tour de France team wasn't using ketones. And the interesting thing about the market is that it's relatively novel still in performance. I know a lot of people have been talking about it for a couple of years, but especially, let's say, with professional Ironman athletes, they still view it more or less as a secret weapon, so they don't really want to talk about it. So it's kind of bittersweet for us, where we have these really big name athletes using deltaG, but they don't really want to spread the word. So because they still view it as kind of their secret sauce.
Yeah, and it is funny. So some of the people who are saying, "Oh no, it's terrible" and everything, they're using it. They're buying it, and yet they're saying it's terrible because they don't want people to know that they're buying it.
Yeah.
It is funny. It is funny. People are funny.
Well, that's kind of a tactic then, if you know something works really well, you just say, oh, I would never use this. Nobody should use this. I think it's awful. They
Very
taste bad
strategic.
and they don't help your performance. Don't stay away from that stuff. And then you can, use it while everybody else is thinking it's bad.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, Professor Clarke, you mentioned, I think, I haven't heard of really this concept of the ketone sweet spot, which is very interesting. So there seems to kind of be this threshold maybe effect where if you're above 2, below 4, you might see some of the beneficial effects on endurance performance. Has that threshold kind of been shown in the research where that 2 millimolar sort of threshold exists?
Well, it was certainly shown in that review, in Kevin O'Fallon's review, and he went through all the literature and worked out what the levels were when the test was done, and I think that that's to do with performance. But then, of course, people are drinking it for recovery, and it will help with recovery. And then your recovery, but then if you're in the Tour de France, then you need to recover because you've got to go out the next day and do exactly the same thing. So and then recovery helps performance the next day. So all in all, I think it's a complete plan. It's not just performance, it's recovery, it's sleep. So people are drinking it for sleep. So all of these things add up to good performance the next day.
Yeah, and Peter Hessel's group that I think you mentioned, that's exactly what they did. They took the ketone ester after a really hard training session, and then they took another dose right before sleep, and that's where they noticed the 50% increase in workload among the group that were taking the ketone ester.
Yeah, and that was is that the overtraining study that you're referring to?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, that one was a very interesting study. I know that's kind of received a little bit of not necessarily criticism, but I think one of the major maybe limitations of that study was that the ketone ester group ended up consuming more calories throughout the overtraining period, as well as more of their calories from, I guess, a greater amount of carbohydrates than the non-ketone ester group. In my opinion, that didn't really matter because the ketone was having some effect, like regardless, whether it was to increase their appetite and allow them to eat more. But I found that study very interesting in terms of preventing the overtraining effect. But regarding recovery, I know, Professor Clarke, what do you think maybe some of the main mechanisms for that are? Because I've heard many sort of reasons as to why ketones might benefit recovery. And I think that the main two might be perhaps reducing glycogen depletion, or maybe helping glycogen replenishment, and then perhaps preventing some sort of protein catabolism during exercise, or maybe even increasing like protein synthesis post-exercise. Are any of those speculations valid?
I think they're all valid. I think that's exactly what the ketone is doing. So it's allowing glucose to go into glycogen. I mean, you don't have to completely deplete glycogen for the glycogen to be down, but you do want as much glycogen before you start the next day. You want it back. And so I think it certainly helps with the glycogen levels, but it also helps with muscle, and it stops the muscle being broken down to make glucose, of course. And so it's stopping muscle breakdown. But it also, I'm not sure that it helps with protein resynthesis. But then if you're not breaking down your muscle, then you don't really need to replete it more. So I think it works on all different levels. It also decreases inflammation. And some Tour de France riders have actually said, look, it stops their muscles aching overnight, so that they don't get, the muscle stiffness and things like that. And so I think it's a combination of things. I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's all of them.